Braves manager Brian Snitker spoke to the media at the winter meetings, and he doesn't know how long he'll keep coaching for. Yes, welcome on in to Braves Today for Tuesday, December 10th. Your source of news, notes, and updates on your Atlanta Braves. I'm your host, Lindsay Crosby. You can follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Crosby Baseball. You can follow the show on Twitter, Braves_today. We have a Facebook page and Instagram as well. And you can find all of my written work, bravestoday.com. That's the Braves Today Substack, as this is both a podcast and a newsletter. And unfortunately, we are not at the winter meetings this year. I actually spent about 24 hours in Dallas traveling back from my family trip, but I had to be home for a family medical thing. And so we are reporting remotely from the winter meetings, right? What everybody says in their press conferences, what a lot of the Braves beat reports. And the big story that came out of Monday at the winter meetings is manager Brian Snitker was one of about the 20 managers who had a media availability with the accumulated writers there in Dallas. And we're going to talk about what Brian Snitker said about the rotation, how he feels about the rotation right now. We're going to talk about his thoughts on Juan Soto signing with the New York Mets. But first, I want to get to what Brian Snitker said about his future in Atlanta. He is entering his 10th season as manager, right? He took over as the interim manager in 2016 from Freddie Gonzalez. And so 2025 will be his 10th season as manager. It'll be his 49th season with the organization. In 1977, after leaving the University of New Orleans, Brian Snitker joined the organization as a catcher. He played for, I believe it was 4 years before becoming a coach in the organization. And he is now at the point of second all-time in wins in the organization behind, obviously, Bobby Cox. And he's not going to catch Bobby Cox. 2,149 wins for Bobby Cox. Brian Snitker is 735 and 582. A 69-year-old man is not going to catch Bobby Cox in wins, but he is second in wins. And speaking to the media yesterday, and then a follow-up conversation that Snit had with Justin Toscano of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which you can find that story, ajc.com. He talked about his future. He signed a 3-year contract extension in January 2023. This is the final year of that deal. And it's very rare for MLB managers to coach on the final year of their contract. Typically, they're extended before they get into that final season. Or if a team doesn't want to extend the manager, usually they end up making a change, right? We see a couple weird situations. Skip Schumacher in Miami this year actually had the team take the club option away to put him into the final year of his deal because he was planning on leaving after the season. That is not the situation here in Atlanta, okay? By all reports we have, the Atlanta Braves are happy with Brian Snitker, and it comes down to how does Brian Snitker feel at the end of the season? And he explained that, talking to Justin Toscano. Here's the quote that Justin published last night in the AJC. I'm up in the air right now, which I'll be honest with you, I have been for, when you get to my age, you do that. If I'm still enjoying what I'm doing, I'll think about it. And that goes back to Snit's relationship with Bobby Cox. Bobby Cox was his mentor. They've been friends for a long time. And he, talking to Justin, he reiterated that point. And he said, I feel great. I remember Bobby said that too. The year he was going to retire, he says, God, if I'd known I would have felt this good, I wouldn't have retired. He's like, which is good. I hope I do feel good. We'll just see. We'll see where I am at some point. And 69 years old, it's absolutely understandable that Snit wants to take his time and figure out how he feels physically, how he feels mentally and emotionally, his family's tolerance to continue to do this. His son is a coach. Troy is the hitting coach with Houston. His wife has now followed him around the minor leagues and major leagues for almost 50 years. And it totally makes sense that he would want to take his time and decide how he feels. This is speculation. This is not reporting, but I feel pretty confident that if Brian Snitker feels good at the end of this season and wants to come back for his 50th year as coach, which would be the 2026 season, the Atlanta Braves will give him a contract to do that. He did clarify to Justin he doesn't really care about hitting 50 years with the organization. He said, I don't have to get to 50. I think it'd be a really neat number to achieve, and I feel great. That's the thing. I still feel really good, but I don't have to do that. I've been in it so long. When I got this job, I didn't need to be a big league manager to validate my career. It happened. I'm glad I did. This has been a really cool thing to experience for the last 10 years. He's won a World Series with Atlanta. Again, 735 and 582. It's a 558 winning percentage. It has been, it's really hard to argue that there are more than just a few managers in the history of the Atlanta Braves that have been better as manager of the Atlanta Braves than Brian Snitker. Yes, we have complaints about some of his in-game decisions, right? There are times when we think that Brian Snitker is too rigid in bullpen roles, right? We saw him flex a little bit on that later in the year, right? We saw him, they were willing to use Iglesias for 2 innings to bring him in the 8th if they had to seal a win, things like that. But for the most part, Snit's been a pretty good manager for the Braves. And honestly, the players love him. Brian Snitker is consistently one of the better regarded managers in baseball. We've seen player surveys from The Athletic. We've seen free agents talk about it. The clubhouse atmosphere, the culture around the team, Snitker's leadership, those are genuine things that players have expressed an appreciation for. And longtime Braves fans will remember the whole situation with Nick Markakis. This was, I think, 2017 is when this happened. Jim Johnson, the team was in a losing streak. Jim Johnson had losses closers role because he was underperforming. And Snit brought Johnson into a close game that they ended, I think it was 5-4 against Seattle in the 8th. And they end up losing the game because Jim Johnson gives up some runs, right? The Braves ended up losing 9-6. And it was because of Jim Johnson. And John Hart, who was president of baseball operations at the time, and John Capella was general manager. And apparently, Hart and Capella came downstairs and met with Snit in his office and were shouting at Snit in his office loudly enough that where some players heard it. And Nick Markakis apparently told some staffers to pass the message along that, and I'm going to paraphrase here, this is all reported by David O'Brien of The Athletic, by the way, back when he was with the AJC, that if Hart ever treated Snit that way again, Markakis would kick his ass. I don't know if he said the exact words, kick his ass, but he let him know that was what would happen. He emphasized treating people like human beings and said pretty much they were going to stand up and they were going to defend Snit. And I remember that season. Snit wasn't the same the rest of the year. But also, those guys weren't around very much longer because Capella did some stupid stuff. And that team was a losing team that Hart and Capella built. And that's the kind of relationship that Snit has with these players, right? He is authentic. He is genuine. He will tell you exactly what he feels. if you ask a dumb question, which I have asked a dumb question of Snit before in the dugout, he will politely, not rudely, but politely let you know that was a dumb question. Specifically, this was in spring training. I was asking about the outfield competition between Forrest Wall and guys like that. If Forrest Wall had done enough to make the opening day roster or something like that, which it turned out he had, right? He did make the opening day roster. But there was like a week and a half of spring training left, or 2 weeks of spring training left. And I really can't answer that now. He's like, there's a couple weeks of a game still. And so, like, I'm happy with what he's done. And he talked about some of the things. But I can't answer that yet. We don't know. There's more games to be played. And that's who Snit is. Let's play the games and we'll figure out what happens. That was his response to Juan Soto signing with the Mets, by the way. We'll get to that in just a minute. But this is something where Snit doesn't get like, he's not the type of manager who's going to go in the clubhouse and throw stuff and shout and yell, right? Reportedly, when he was a minor league manager younger in his career, he did do that. He was that kind of guy, but he's not anymore. And I think in this clubhouse the Braves have built, where you have all of these veterans and you are trying to, maybe not trying to, but you have built this culture of we are professionals and we're going to go out and we're going to do our jobs, right? We're not going to micromanage you. We're not going to get too fancy. You're going to go out and you're going to play ball every day. I think that Snit is the right manager for this team in this clubhouse. And as much as we sometimes complain about some of his idiosyncrasies, his weaknesses, whatever, I do think that Brian Snitker is the right manager for the Braves. And I do agree with the philosophy that Snit has talked about here, where as long as he feels good, he wants to continue to coach, and the team will continue to support him and allow him to do that. And so it's one of the few situations where a guy does not have a contract for 2026. And I'm not worried that he wouldn't get one if he meets with Alex in January or March or June and says, I feel really good still. I want to keep coaching. They'll give him a new contract. I feel like that's where we are with Brian Snitker. In just a minute, let's talk about what he did say about Juan Soto signing, and let's talk about what he said about the rotation for next season. We'll do that next, right here on Braves Today. Welcome back to Braves Today. Lindsay Crosby talking about the Atlanta Braves at the winter meetings, and specifically manager Brian Snitker and what he said both to the media and then separately to Justin Toscano of the AJC about his future. And we're going to do a bigger show on Soto this week. I was holding it in case something big broke at the winter meetings, but we're going to do a show on the state of the division now that Juan Soto is signed and how he's done historically against Atlanta. Spoiler alert, it's really good, and all of that. But he did talk about, he was asked about his reaction to Juan Soto signing with the Mets. He was asked about his reaction to that and his thoughts about the ability to win the division with that happen. And the quote here is, our goal is still going to be the same, which is to win the division. I don't care who signs who and what teams put what together, because we've still got to play for 6 months. It doesn't do anything for us. And I think that this is, if this was about Philly, they would put this on the bulletin board and they would like contrive some sort of grievance here to try to get fired up to do their jobs. That's what Philly does. But this is Snit being Snit, right? A lot of stuff can happen in a 162 game season. And this is, they added a great player. Okay, great. We're going to get Ronald Acuna Jr. back at some point in time, right? We don't know when, and we don't know what condition he'll be in, but we're going to get him back. And Snit's like, okay, let's play the games. It's hard to look at that Mets team as currently constructed, especially with all of the pitching questions that they have, right? I mean, they added Frankie Montas, but they lost Severino and Minaya. And it doesn't necessarily feel like they've gotten better on the pitching side, right? And so, I'm sorry, they added Clay Holmes too. My bad. They added Clay Holmes, who they're converting to a starter. I think the right mindset to have about this, both from you don't want to look like you are worried, but also the belief in your guys, the right mindset is, I don't care who signs where. Let's play the games, which makes sense if you think about it. I'm glad that is the mindset that Snit has. And then also about the rotation, it was the same thought process. He didn't necessarily say anything about, he's not worried about it. His quote, and literally he said he wasn't worried about it. It's the second week of December, so I'm not worried about that either. We'll still go to camp. We'll probably get 7 guys at least stretched out and ready to go because we're going to use them all again. That thing's going to be shuffled around. We're going to need a lot of guys just like we did last year. And I think 7's not a terrible target. The last 4 seasons, 21, 22, 23, and 24, Atlanta has every year used between 10 and 13 conventional starters. So in that count of conventional starters, I am counting relievers who made spot starts, right? Grant Holmes, who came in and would pitch 4 or 5 innings. I'm counting him in there. But a guy who has come in as an opener, pitched an inning and then left the game, I'm not counting him in that. And it's 10 to 13 every single season. And so I like the idea of, for a fact you have Sale, you have Lopez, you have Schwellenbach. Anthopoulos told us the other day, Sunday, Grant Holmes would get a chance to win a starting job. You'll have Ian Anderson. You'll have AJ Smith-Shawver. You've got a couple options there, right? Now, Mark Bowman of MLB.com talked about bringing back Charlie Morton. Seems like it would he wrote a whole story about this. He thinks that would make more sense than adding Nathan Eovaldi if your goal is innings. And there was a quote from AA, and I'm holding the clip right now because I want to do a whole show on this. But there was a clip from AA on Sunday in that press conference about innings per start and how valuable that has been. And while I don't have the research on all of the innings per start, the averages for these guys, you can look at, Bowman makes the case for Charlie Morton over Nathan Eovaldi because Nathan Eovaldi's expected to get a 3-year deal worth $20 million or more per season. He turns 35 this spring, so it'd be 35, 36, 37. Whereas Charlie Morton's expected to get 1 year, $10 million, maybe 1 year, 15 at the worst. And Morton has made 30 or more starts in each of the last 6 full-length seasons, so not counting 2020. Whereas Eovaldi's only done that twice in his career. And if you are content with the top of your rotation, if you're content with Sale and Lopez and Schwellenbach, and then eventually whenever Strider gets back, what condition he'll be in. Is he 85% of who he is? Is he 90%? Is he 95%? What percentage of Spencer Strider is he when he returns? Then I can see the benefit of getting a guy like Charlie Morton who can eat innings over the summer over getting a guy that probably has a higher ceiling in Nathan Eovaldi. 3.80 ERA last year, 29 starts, almost 24% strikeout rate, one of the higher marks of his career. His postseason ERA in 12 starts is a 2.85. So you feel like if you get to the postseason and you need him to make a start, which Atlanta's been looking for starters every year, it feels like in the postseason, you have an option there, whereas you probably don't use Morton in the postseason. But is, say, $22 million on a 3-year deal for Eovaldi, is the delta between him and Morton The difference you would get in performance between Eovaldi and Morton, is that worth the extra money and the longer term commitment that Eovaldi is going to require over a guy like Morton? I'm not planting my flag in the ground one way or the other on that, but that's the answer you have to decide if you're the Atlanta Braves. And I think a lot of that comes back to how you feel about Spencer Strider and when he's going to come back and what sort of state he'll be in. Because you have plenty of options for the back end of the rotation, right? Bryce Elder is still a guy that exists. And you feel like you could probably improve him a little bit. I like what Grant Holmes has done as a starter. I think he could succeed in that role. Ian Anderson's an option to bounce back. AJ Smith-Shawver, which, clarification here, shout out to one of our regular listeners, Mass Boost. Because AJ Smith-Shawver is likely going to use his third option so early in his career, he will get a fourth option year. This is not the final year that you can send AJ Smith-Shawver back up and down. You'll have one more after this. But there's a legit decision to be made here. And Snit isn't necessarily concerned about the rotation, right? Because you have plenty of time. He still thinks you'll get probably 7 guys competing, maybe 8 guys competing for 5 spots in camp, and the best guy's going to win it. And that's Snit. Best guy's going to play. We're going to do that. Does he defer to veterans? Yes, he defers to veterans. But the best guy's going to play. Forrest Wall made the opening day roster last year because he played so well in spring training. Now, did he stick around with the Braves? No. He was let go and he ended up joining the Marlins eventually, right? I think he actually started a game against Atlanta with the Marlins, but he played the best of all of the depth outfielders in spring training, and he made the opening day roster as a result. That's Snit's thing, right? Whoever does the best on the field gets the spot. We love that. Snit also did address Travis d'Arnaud leaving. And this is something where it was obviously unexpected. And I've talked about this at length now. Somebody complained on the comments of yesterday's show that I keep bringing this up. And the reason I brought it up yesterday is we had new information. We understood when Atlanta changed their mind from when they talked to us and said they were likely going to pick up Travis's option to when they changed their mind and decided not to. Snit went on the record for the first time since that option was declined to talk about Travis d'Arnaud. And he said, I'm a big Travis fan. It's always going to be difficult, I think, when you lose somebody of Travis's pedigree and what he brings to your team. It's more about the guy. It's more about the guy. He's a great player, has been for a long time. I'm happy for him that he's back home and the situation he got in. And Travis d'Arnaud became one of the big clubhouse leaders after you lost Freddie Freeman and Dansby Swanson. And so now you're going to need a veteran to step up on the position player side in the clubhouse and be a leader. Is that Matt Olson? Is that Austin Riley? Both those guys are quieter guys, right? They're not super vocal guys. Is it one of those guys? Is it somebody else? We don't really know. But Snit acknowledged that he's not as worried as a lot of fans might be about finding a leader. And the quote here, they asked me that when we lost Freddie, Dansby, and all that. I don't worry about that. Locker room's full of leader-type guys, the strong makeup guys that play. And I think those leaders, they lead by example, how they come to work every day, how they prepare, the energy with which they play. Probably the last thing that I worry about is the credibility and the so-called leadership in the room. Is anything in this really surprising that Snit said? No, but I think it's good to hear the honesty, right? That he was surprised that Travis d'Arnaud left. And he also clarified here, he's not privy to a lot of the roster stuff. He actually said, I can just speculate on the roster things. I'm not privy to a lot going on, just things that happen. There's decisions and things you do that put in your club together. And he wasn't he made it clear he wasn't part of the conversation to not pick up the option for Travis d'Arnaud. And he did also explain that he was hoping maybe they'd bring him back in free agency before he signed with the Angels. He also clarified he wasn't like the coaching moves. That was something, again, they weren't necessarily expecting to do that. And then they turned around and ended up doing that. But all in all, Brian Snitker's optimistic about this team next season. And part of that, I can hear people now. That's his job. He's paid by the team, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, Brian Snitker's been pretty transparent with us, right? He's told us when a guy underperformed or when a guy screwed up. He's been pretty, and he didn't do it in a way to demean the guy, right? He still would protect the guy, but he would acknowledge that things weren't done correctly and we're going to get it fixed. He wouldn't throw the guy under the bus, but he would acknowledge that, yeah, you were right to notice that that was wrong and we're going to fix it. It's fine. And so when Snit says he's not worried about the rotation, he's not worried about the leadership. He's not worried about not being able to compete for the division in 2025. I'm going to believe him because he's around these guys every day. He knows these players better than any of us do. And while, yeah, maybe Snit frustrates us from time to time with some of his decisions, his rigidity on, when to pull a pitcher or what pitcher to go to out of the bullpen, things like that, the things he can actually control. At the same time, he's a pretty good manager. He's one of the better managers statistically in Braves history, whether or not we want to acknowledge that. Second place in wins all time at 735 behind Bobby Cox, his mentor. So I feel good about 2025. And yes, I'll acknowledge we still have work to do, right? We still need to figure out adding a starter. We still need to figure out the outfield. And I think if you make Mark Bowman's suggested addition of Charlie Morton over Nathan Eovaldi, it needs to be because you are prioritizing the money to go get a game changer in the outfield, right? Now, we know from AA's comments, he doesn't want to give up a draft pick, so you're not going to go sign a qualifying offer guy. Michael Conforto's already off the board, but there are plenty of impact bats that you can get for the outfield at this point in free agency. Now, so maybe it's, and Bowman suggested Max Kepler, Jurickson Profar. I don't know if those were sourced or if those were just his ideas of what would work. We've talked about those similar guys. I was higher on Kepler than I was on Profar, but I think that's the next big thing we're watching for is what does Atlanta do in the outfield and at starting pitcher. We also got some news from the winter meetings. AJ Minter is a hot topic right now. John Morosi reported he's one of the more popular free agent lefty relievers right now, which there's a ton of those available. The Braves are obviously in on bringing him back. The Cubs have interest in AJ Minter. They like cut right fastballs, and he does some stuff like that. The Rangers, Minter's from Texas. I think he went to Texas Tech. And so the Rangers are in on him as well. So we'll see what happens. We'll see if Atlanta's able to bring him back or not. But either way, the winter meetings so far are Texas A&M, not Texas Tech. My apologies, AJ. But as of right now, the winter meetings, not a lot of activity going on, but we're still getting a lot of great information about the Atlanta Braves. This has been Braves Today for Tuesday, December 10th. If you're listening on audio, do us a favor, leave us a 5-star review. If you're on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell. Maybe go ahead and also leave us a 5-star review. Those really help people discover the show. Until next time, this has been Braves Today.